Presiding Officer, it's clear from these figures that the wave of Omicron that has been predicted is now rapidly developing. Omicron now accounts for around 80% of all cases, and over the past week, the number of reported cases of COVID overall has increased by 47%. We should also bear in mind that any transmission over recent days will not yet be fully evident in the reported figures. So it is reasonable to assume that we will continue to see steep increases in cases in the days and indeed possibly in the weeks ahead. That said, it is also important to remember that our individual and collective behaviour will influence how fast or otherwise the virus spreads. The current surge would almost certainly be even higher, but for so many people following advice to cut down on social interactions in the run-up to Christmas. And given the speed and extent of the transmission we are experiencing now, it is really vital that we all continue to take sensible precautions and limit social interactions for a further period as we learn more about the likely impact of this wave of infection and as we complete the booster vaccination programme. Obviously, one of the factors we are looking at most closely is the proportion of Omicron cases that require hospital treatment. This will tell us more about the severity of Omicron for individuals and also about the overall impact that it's likely to have on the NHS. This will therefore inform our ongoing response. Before I say more about that, though, it is worth emphasising that there are other reasons to do all we can at this stage to slow down the spread. Firstly, whatever the overall impact of Omicron turns out to be, we know that this virus will cause serious illness and death for some. We also know that for others, long COVID will cause ongoing suffering. Secondly, we know that high levels of infection and therefore sickness absence will be disruptive to the economy and the delivery of critical services, and I'll say more later about how we are seeking to mitigate this. However, as things stand, none of us should be complacent about getting COVID. We should take steps to avoid it if we can. There is no doubt, however, that the data we are looking at most closely just now is the conversion of cases into hospital admissions. And there are here some grounds for optimism. Over the past week, published studies have suggested that the risk of hospitalisation from Omicron is lower, possibly significantly lower than for other strains of the virus. What is not yet fully understood is why this might be the case, whether it is because Omicron is inherently less severe or because of its greater ability to infect those who have had prior infection or been vaccinated, which means that more of those who get it carry a level of immunity that protect them from more serious illness. We don't yet know the answer to that, but either way, if it is the case that a much lower proportion of people with Omicron need hospital care compared to other strains of the virus, that is really good news, especially as Omicron is now the dominant strain, and good news both in terms of individual health and overall impact. And of course, it would inform how we respond in the weeks ahead. However, and this remains key, for at least the next couple of weeks, we do need to show continued caution as we assess in real time the impact that these higher case numbers will have on the NHS. It is encouraging that, at least until now, the rise in cases experienced over the past few weeks has not translated into a corresponding rise in hospital admissions or occupancy. On the contrary, the number of people in hospital with COVID has so far remained broadly stable. However, again, we do need to exercise caution. The numbers in hospital with COVID in England is now rising quite sharply, which may be a sign of things to come here. And indeed, today's reported increase in hospital occupancy here of 80 is the biggest increase that we have seen for some time. We also know that there is a time lag between rising cases and rising hospital admissions. And of course, in terms of sheer numbers, the benefits of a lower rate of hospitalisation could be quickly cancelled out by the much higher case numbers resulting from significantly increased transmissibility. So we will monitor all of this data very carefully in the days to come. As well as looking at headline numbers, we will also be interrogating the detail, for example, the breakdown between those in hospital because of COVID and those in hospital who have COVID but who were admitted for different reasons. And we'll also be looking at whether the average length of stay in hospital for those with Omicron is different to other variants. All in all, I would expect that within the next couple of weeks we will have a clearer picture, and that this will then help us reach informed judgments about the most proportionate response going forward. In the meantime, however, while we better understand the impacts and while more and more of us get the added protection of booster vaccinations, which will of course help reduce the impacts of Omicron, we must try to avoid the sheer volume of cases overwhelming us. That is why it is prudent, indeed I would say it is essential, that we do act to slow transmission at this stage as much as possible. Indeed, that is why additional protections were announced last week and are now in force, and I'll summarise these shortly. And it's also why over Hogmanay and New Year's Day, and for at least the first week of January, we are advising everyone to stay at home more than normal, to reduce contacts with people outside our own households, and to limit the size of any indoor social gatherings that do take place so that they don't include people from any more than 3 households. Also try to ventilate indoor spaces as much as possible, and it remains our advice, our strong advice, that lateral flow tests should be taken just before meeting up with anyone from another household. And if that shows a positive result, it is vital to immediately isolate and book a PCR test. You should also isolate and book a PCR test if you have symptoms that might be COVID. Following this advice is difficult and frustrating at the best of times, I know, but it is even harder at this time of year. But it really does help, and it will be helping already, notwithstanding these very high case numbers. So please do stick with it for now. In addition to this general advice to the public, the new protective measures relating to hospitality, public indoor places and live events that I set out last week are now in force. We will review these on an ongoing basis, but at this stage our expectation is that they will be in force until the 17th of January.